Hello, my friends, and it's a pleasure to present Algorithmic Diversity, Zero Exclusion, AI, and Ethics session. My name is Jonah Welker, and my mission is to reshape a future of algorithmic diversity, accessible technology, specifically in aspects of disability, neurodiversity, gender, women, youth. At some point, I realized that this mission is extremely complex, so I work on a variety of niches and directions. On one hand, I work as an evaluator, public evaluator, and screener for technology related to the future of the AI, future of learning, working with the ecosystems like European Commission or MIT. Also, I work in policy field mostly as an advocate and activist in order to promote ethical approach to AI robotics, specifically in terms of a disabled individuals and groups, women, children. Recently, I presented human-centered AI and ethics, and currently I'm working on technology transfer and evaluation for accessibility lens. Another thing, I collect early stage ventures and emerging companies in technologies focused on the future of learning, healthcare, well-being, targeting such challenges as autism, dyslexia, neuromuscular disorder, mental health, aging, longevity, and many others. And finally, I'm trying to democratize this movement, involve more and more people, specifically underrepresented ones, women, ethnic minorities. For instance, just a few months ago we organized Zero Exclusion Hackathon with women in AI in United States. Before we successfully worked with MIT in Middle East, Africa, Asia, and currently we're working on another hackathon focused on accessibility with women in AI APAC. So just in advance, I really encourage you to check it out. So as I mentioned, I'm focused on accessibility for people with disabilities, neurodiversity, on autism spectrum. An extremely complex and complicated challenge for all of us, including myself. I have both very severe autoimmune disorder, but also I'm neurodiverse myself, and I spend most of my life being isolated, seeing how actually people with such conditions are rejected, isolated, and completely excluded from society, both on the level of healthcare, education. And on one hand, we see many positive things like social robotics, which actively used at schools of United States. I'm personally work with the AI tracking for dyslexia, which now used in Denmark and some Nordic countries. We use adoption of neurodiverse hiring and many other technologies. We even use biofeedback for creative fields and arts in order to help people with physical disabilities being involved in control of external environment or devices. But unfortunately, if we go on the deeper level, we see the same statistic like 90% of people with autism are not employed. One of 10 people with the disabilities actually have an access to inclusive technology. So actually on the social level, statistic is pretty sad. But more importantly, with the emerging technology, with more products we work in this field, we face more challenges related not only social, not only economic perspective, but also from technology and ethics and policy perspective, including fairness, bias, exclusion on the level of AI, problems of accountability when we use, for instance, facial recognition or computer vision in nursing, in caregiving field, transparency, the problems of children protection, general accessibility to these solutions, ecosystems for caregivers, the problems of autonomy in human involvement, safety, well-being, and many, many, many others. So in this session, I present exploration of my work and work of my colleagues We try to connect many dots. Some of them present Tech London's Advocates Disability Working Group. I have so amazing peers in ecosystem like Remarkable Accelerator in Australia. So we literally connect these dots across the different countries and ecosystems. I'm mostly focused with working with European Commission. So this session will present a recent exploration how we can fix it, which key challenges we have in terms of accessibility specifically for neurodiverse individuals, which key areas we need to improve, which key stats we have, and which key solutions we can use in order to make these steps as soon as possible. Because it's important to mention we have enough research, we have enough actually even technology, but we extremely disconnected. We're extremely far from actual adoption. So even though we have, for instance, social robot or AI tracking, eye tracking for dyslexia or emotional recognition glasses, it's so far from a widespread, democratized way to actually make it accessible, safe, transparent, and accountable in all of the levels. So in this session, I try to present what we can do in which areas we need to improve. So first of all, the first thing I would love discuss with you is a problem of representation and accessible research. There's a popular idiom: AI can be solution for any problem in the world, but at the same time, it can be a source of an apocalypse, depending who and how ask question. And when we work with technologists in healthcare, well-being, working on social robots, we actually try to understand who actually involved in research, working with parents, families, mothers of autistic children, for instance. But unfortunately, today we face a dramatic diversity crisis in AI and data science research. There's just around 30% of the authors being women compared to 15% in STEM in general. And unfortunately, we see even worse situation for other groups like disabled people or neurodiverse people. For instance, in the past, we made an experiment when disabled person created CD, the same content, but in one CD, this person actually mentioned that this person is disabled and requires some accommodation. In another case, this person didn't make it. And unfortunately, CD, this disability, have a much worse conversion, and most people, these people are rejected it. And in the end, the people who should ask questions, being involved in research, deal with women, children, parents, neurodiverse, disabled, they have no idea about it. We have no empathy. And in the end, we have some kind of an echo chamber and filter bubble of people who actually involved in this field, and they believe that we equal all and one size should fit all, or we just don't care with how it works. And unfortunately, with representation crisis, in the end, affect technology. So before talking about any kind of ethical, any kind of AI ethics, data science, privacy, and other things, I talk about representation because until we actually try to democratize and decentralize with vertical of power, with vertical of research, with vertical of design thinking, because everything until today was created by the same type of a mind, the same type of a man, the same type of ethnical group, and after that we just try to push anyone to this ecosystem in order to make them fit in it, even though it's completely different for them. It doesn't work for them. The same with their workplaces, classrooms, cities, and so on. We can create accessible design, inclusive design, in trying to implement one fits one approach until we actually have a representation of voices who actually involved in this problem. Other things is the children's rights and protection. Most of the people who are affected by, for instance, social AI, social robots, adaptive learning are children. We use this technology from individuals starting around 5 years old, 5, 6 years old. But until 2020, we had no frameworks which actually regulate AI and children, data and children, though most of the content consumers on YouTube and any platforms are teenagers or children. And people who will be affected by emerging technology in accessibility field, in disability field, specifically in learning, well-being, caregiving, are young people. But we had no any kind of framework, and currently working with the many companies and emerging technologies in this field, we actually created from the scratch. Only in 2020, UNICEF came up with a framework, AI in children, and also there is a project driven by World Economic Forum called Generation AI. But until this moment, we had no any kind of a clear guidelines which allow us to understand how to create actually safe technology for children, how to keep in mind everything related to safety, well-being, anti-harassment, cognitive issues, cognitive impairment, relationship with caregivers, and so on. Just nothing. And only now we're starting to work in this field, but it's just a beginning, and we should fix it as soon as possible. And the recent technology transfer and evaluation for accessibility lens, I'm actually put this notice is extremely important. Hopefully many of my colleagues started to continue this work, and I hope to see more updates in this field, maybe in this or next year. But unfortunately, until today, we had no any regulation. Another thing is a human rights, bioethics, and accessible vocabulary. I work with many AI ethics professionals who try to be, let's say, integrated in companies like Twitter, Amazon, or Microsoft in order to make technology more ethical. But unfortunately, it doesn't work until actually the whole organization has any idea about bioethics, human rights. Then actually everyone, including designers, developers, board members, actually care about it. They have the same vocabulary, they talk the same language, and they actually understand the scope of a problem and are able to elaborate it on any level of the development, deployment, and implementation of a technology. But another problem that ethics professionals, but also bounded by any kind of a limitation in terms of a privacy by this organization. Maybe you know we have so many scandals related to whistleblowers. Some people try to make this organization more ethical, safer for children, for women, for disabled, but they bounded by any kind, different kind of a limitation, the contracts, NDA, and so on. So on one hand, we have no accessible vocabulary to talk about these problems. We have no law, we have no bioethics which actually implemented on every level of this organization. And finally, they're just not able to act. So until we reshape the whole mechanics, until we understand how to put social science into organization, not just developers, designers, because most of the people with philosophical and liberal arts education now are either unemployed, either they become designers or creatives, but they should use their knowledge in gender studies, in cultural studies, and ethnic studies in order to help us to deal with research of elders, children, women. We need you. And we need to reshape how we see technology ecosystem, technology teams. We need to push social scientists along with the designer, developer, and anyone who implement this inclusive design. How you plan to implement it without any kind of idea about African women, Asian women, and that's why we have a bias. But we have no any kind of even knowledge behind how to solve it. And now you talk about more ethical technology. It doesn't work until we actually implement social science. Another thing is fairness, bias, and zero exclusion. Um, it's important to mention that we organized Women in AI hackathon in United States, and it was called Zero Exclusion, not Inclusion. Why? Because I believe zero exclusion is much more important because we need to understand why we exclude someone initially. What was behind it? Technology problem, or maybe people problem, human problem, problem of a prejudices, racism, or hatred towards particular groups. And maybe it was not unconscious but pretty conscious bias. And maybe it's a problem of people behind it. Currently we have many problems when, for instance, Nikon's web cameras don't work properly with Asian faces. There are numerous cases of facial recognition issues related to African people and people of color. There are many cases related to hiring and vetting tools in Amazon where discovered to systematically discriminate against women. But once again, the problem in people behind these algorithms. And we should understand how we design technology, we start to exclude. And more importantly, how we create society, how we create social construct behind Silicon Valley and now emerging technologies in Europe and APAC, because we just try to copy paste this model, which completely doesn't work, because just a few percent of the companies focused on accessibility actually get funding. It's extremely complicated goal to them to get any kind of a support. It's not the same as build another Snapchat, build social robot for children. It's much more complicated. It requires not only knowledge, experience, and empathy, but also enormous amount of courage, because nobody cares. All the people you see in 500 startups in our ecosystem who talk about unity and other things, they don't care about inclusion. They don't care about disability. They have no any kind of effort towards accessibility. We don't support disability technology. They completely don't care about it. Silicon Valley don't care about people of color, Asian people, disabled people, and I can state it. I see it every day. Racism's everywhere. Prejudices is everywhere. And we should not copy this model. It's just terrible. And this bias behind the technology is actual source, but they're not able to talk about it. Other thing is accountability agents and accountable agents and accountability in general. It's just what I'm talking about before. We often talk about bias. There is a amazing movie called Coded Bias, which actually raise many discussions about biases behind AI used in facial recognition, specifically related to people of color. It's a significant problem. But more importantly, when we raise this awareness, when we start the discussion, we should talk about legal mechanism and construct, how we actually put the level of accountability for these actions, because in AI ethics we have actions and we have omissions, so-called no actions. So every time when we create something, we tested it, deploy and implement, there's a chain of people who involved in it, including designers, including developers, including product managers, and there are people who should be accountable to actually stop, for instance, technology which have some kind of a prejudices in training data or not relevant data, and so on. Unfortunately, both on legal, on ethical levels, we had no enough discussion about how to actually create the mechanism of accountability from end to end. Another thing what I would love to talk about is accessibility and comorbidity. Most of the people we work with are autistic children, people on autism spectrum, people with mental health disorders, elders, people with chronic disorders. Unfortunately, though initially we create solution, for instance, dedicated to particular challenge, for instance, one of our startup work on data analytics for autism development. But as we explore further, patients have a many kind of comorbid conditions, for instance, ADHD, depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive syndrome, sensory, physical, and cognitive impairment. There are many additional problems which actually put the question how we design solution, how we make it accessible not only in terms of a general user flow, in general questions we ask during the interview, but also additional accessibility related to, for instance, visual impairment, hearing impairment, some kind of a level of a cognitive impairment, making design thinking it's much more complicated and much more multi-layeral. So it's another thing we try to implement. And that's why, for instance, now when we work with the technologies, we deal both with the caregivers, with parents, we create with children, we create the ecosystems of stakeholders who are involved in order to provide human-centered input into the design flow. And we actually try to discuss it with the whole team of the product managers, designers, developers who actually in touch with what happened inside in order to quickly make changes, for instance, on the level of proof of concept, prototyping, development, and deployment. Another thing is the caregivers. I spent most of my life being isolated and I needed some support, and there are people who require much more support, including people with a cognitive impairment, physical impairment. Most of the children we deal with actually are not able to act like a legal, completely independently from legal perspective. So there are people who are responsible for them, who actually are responsible for actions and making decisions. Typically, these people are parents or caregivers. There are also additional people who are involved in these ecosystems, is educators, teachers, nurses, doctors, people who are involved in some kind of trainings for them, and so on. And that's how we actually create the ecosystems of the caregivers. But unfortunately, in current stage, we had no clear understanding how we put it not only from UX UI perspective, because it's more or less clear. We create different screens for different data input for different agents, stakeholders, and so on. But it makes it more complicated from a legal perspective, for instance, in terms of who's responsible, who is accountable, who make a decision about particular prescription or particular decision, or for instance, if the children makes an input of data and it's not correct, what we should do, how we actually define priority of the data, which was introduced by elder or parent or children. So then we have an ecosystem. It make it more difficult to get actually relevant and equally efficient training data for AI. So the whole pattern and balancing make it more comprehensive, but at the same time it create more questions from legal perspective in terms of a so-called data privacy consent. I mean, in most cases, most of the actions performed by children, but at the same time, person who actually responsible for them are caregivers or parents. So they provide agreement in terms of the actions which can be performed in application or platforms. So it makes the process more multi-layeral, and that's what we try to do. Another thing is autonomy and human involvement. Typically, when we talk about autonomous agents, we talk about self-driving cars. But in autism and accessible technology, autonomy is a part of our work. For instance, social robots on different kind of a computer vision, which will be implemented in nursing practice very soon, almost everywhere, is a either automated, partially, or completely autonomous agents. So we're able to perform particular actions, make decisions, and actually, for instance, exclude someone if we talk about hiring solutions or learning solutions and education, or for instance, social robot which adapt the learning process for a particular child. So though there is no any problem in this process itself, but since we employ autonomous system, we cede some of their autonomy decision-making power to machine. And though delegating one autonomy to an intelligent machine is not an ethical problem itself, the question is if we trust algorithms enough to make decision, where the line when we actually should be involved to make some corrections, or should we involved more or less? What's the proportion? How we actually put the this line of human involvement? And here we try to typically implement the principle of a double checking. Unfortunately, there is no AI as we see it from singularity perspective. We're not able to have actual AI. So all of the stuff we have now, data analytics, any kind of machine learning, making some decisions, it's just a tool for developers, for researchers, for educators, some tool for classroom, for workplaces. But it's not actually a completely autonomous system in terms of a decision which will be really efficient, smart, and biasless. So both in education and well-being, we don't avoid double check principle and human involvement. In order to avoid situation, then machine learning driven system fire some teachers without even clear explanation how it's done, because it lacks transparency. And it's another problem related to transparency and black box problem when more and more people now involved in technology movement. And it's good on one hand, but at the same time, we have a decrease of professionalism, understanding of the model they leverage. And there are many libraries and tools we can use through open source AI platforms, and there are more and more people who try to create something, but they're not completely understand what is behind the model. And unfortunately, since we continue to democratize AI, and many of these people will work on a well-being solution as well, we need people, educators, engineers, and professionals who will be involved in order to make a final decision. For instance, dealing with autistic children, what kind of a curriculum is more relevant? That's why, for instance, when I had a talk with RoboKind working on social robots, they position themselves not as a developers of a hardware or robots. They position themselves as learning companies. Their goal is to provide learning solutions for classrooms, for parents, for autistic neurodiverse children. So we create curriculums, we create learning solutions and recommendations how to actually implement these robots and how to create curriculums which works for different groups, for different age groups, different situations and cases. And it's the future. We can't see the technology which actually replace teachers or parents, but it able to empower it, able to make it more efficient, make it more data driven, but not replace. Because unfortunately, any kind of a complex situation which requires many contexts and understanding specifically on emotional level, all of these cases require people and, more importantly, professionals. Another problem we have today, specifically in terms of the AI for accessibility, for disability field, and specifically is related to autism, mental health, and cognitive impairment, is a problem for echo chambers and filter bubbles. Typically, filter bubble is a state of intellectual isolation what can result for personalized searches when the algorithm selectively guesses what information a user would like to use, and what's what you see on social media and YouTube and many platforms. But something similar now in use in adaptive learning, for instance, for people with cognitive impairment, when we try to understand their previous history of a request, content they like, or learning approaches which work better. It's actually what we can find on learning platforms across the web. And one of the problems we can face is a filter bubble, since some individuals mostly spend their time with robots or with platform or this some kind of a AI and machine learning driven environment, it become completely predictable. It's the same flaw in some kind of a constant safe zone. On one hand, it becomes some kind of echo chamber of topics, but at the same time, these individuals also can lose a part of their human skills. And it's very related to another topic, is the safety and well-being. When social robot, let's say, put people in some kind of a silos, an isolation, and though our goal is to break the borders of isolation for autistic children, in the end, if we don't use technology properly, we can use it into and we can put them into another isolation of the, let's say, comfort zone, the same topic with same educational content, always predictable, because our life is not predictable. It's very uncomfortable, it's very inconvenient. And since children have a light sound sensitivity, we need to protect them, but not in all the cases. So that's why we should differentiate the practice, the curriculum, using both technology, avoiding filter bubbles, using different practices, different curriculums, different studies, different approaches, in order to make it comprehensive, in order to actually make a person that's able to actively communicate and solve all the elements of a pattern and spectrum: mental health, cognitive ability, communication, empathy, emotional recognition, and extremely complex. And we can do it completely on the technology level, at the current stage. Another thing I would love to mention is a technical fixes loop. In agile, in product development, in lean startup movement, we all understand how product development happens. I mean, we have a product boards, we have tasks, we create updates, and let's create the vision. If we define the problem in particular way, so we just need to create another update in order to fix the bug. So it's so-called utilitarian vision. So we have something which works for everyone, and afterward we just deploy updates in order to fix the bugs. It's create a so-called loop of a technical fixes, which what, for instance, we've seen on Facebook and Twitter during the rise of the disinformation. They try to create another algorithms which will be less biasless. But at the same time, Wikipedia continued to use both human curators and machine learning, because in order to fight disinformation, they need both people, actual human curators who find disinformation and understand what is disinformation is, and some kind of technology updates. So technology loop is a situation when you try to solve all the problems only through another technical update without updating your team, your approach, your vision, your ethics framework, your understanding of human rights, your social understanding of a problem. And that's what we try to implement, is the implementation, social development, ethical development, ethical frameworks, the organization along with the product development. Until we actually have it, we just create the bubble with another update that only empower the problem and amplify it, but not actually solve it. And two final points I would love to mention is a privacy and creative ownership. We have enough discussion about privacy, but not so often we talk about privacy in aspect of data ownership. It's important to mention that every time when we create something, we become owners of this. And when we create, for instance, social robot for children with autism, we spend most of the time learning with them, learning from them, or learning with their classroom and using technology as a tool. And so very important to provide not only data privacy, so everything which provided from the user standpoint is secure and is a private, but also creative ownership. So no matter what is created with the tool, what is created within the platform, learning platform, or a supportive platform, or accessible platform, is protected with the ownership with the person, no matter with disability, cognitive impairment, because we have a serious um, a serious danger that it can be actually harmed, or it can be stolen, um, and it can be protected enough, because since this person will have a cognitive impairment, it's not able to, this person not able to create, and it has no ownership. I mean, it can be possible position of another unicorn or technology company. So our goal is to protect both data privacy and ownership. And the final thing I would love to mention is a misuse and harassment. Unfortunately, technology can be used not only in positive but negative ways as well. For instance, over 57% of women reported that they're victims of harassment in social platforms. But at the same time, people with development disabilities experience uh, harassment both online, offline, and neurodiverse individuals. One of the key groups which actually affected with harassment. We supported many projects in this field, and some of them focus mostly on women, some of them both on all genders, and specifically on disabled ones. But unfortunately, we still have enough guidelines and understanding how to create not only a technology which actually safe for a well-being of individuals and groups, but also can guarantee that it can be used in negative way in order to attack someone, specifically patients, students, elders, marginalized groups. We should consider all these scenarios for learning solutions, well-being, robots, and so on. It was just a part of the updates and suggestions I've made recently within the human-centered AI and ethics, and technology transfer and evaluation from accessibility lens. There are over 20 criteria, and we continue to work on it with my colleagues from Disability Working Group. There are many things related to accountability, transparency, technology and development, caregivers, comorbidity. There are more and more emerging conditions which related to neurodiversity, disability. Some of them are driven by autoimmune conditions. Some of them are completely disabled. Some of them involves cognitive impairment, visual impairment, hearing impairment. It push us to understand what design thinking should be completely expanded with so many approaches. It's not just about inclusion, it's about zero exclusion. We should understand why we have created situation when 90% of people with autism are not employed, with one of 10%, only one of 10% of 10 of people with a disability actually having access to inclusive technology. Stop to talk about inclusive society. We have no inclusion. We have no inclusion in 2021. All these people are rejected. Almost all of them, 90%. So we literally create this ecosystem from scratch. There are just a few people who work with us in UK, US, in Europe, Australia. It's emerging community. It's so small. We need so much more efforts. But good news, what we actually able to co-create it. Not only with words, talks, but through hackathons, from bottom-up approach. Most of the technologists which joined us, researchers, advocates, they joined us through community efforts, through the bottom-up approach. And for instance, I welcome people to a hackathon in US. I welcome you in APAC, no matter where you're located. I welcome you to join us in Europe, in any place. Let's do it. Let's work on research. Let's work on policy and ethics. Let's work on technology. Let's democratize it. I mean, most of the hackathons we span through Slack and Zoom. Even though we have a digital divide, now we're able to involve people around the world. Let's do it. I mean, we really have no time for hesitation. I mean, the time is running out. I mean, if we don't start to create it right now, I mean, we actually risk to see the same type of design thinking, the same type of products, institutions, classrooms, workplaces, which continue to be focused on exclusion of people, not inclusion. So, driven by motto of this conference, it's time to be included in everyone is included. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share this talk. I spent around 60 talks this year. It was pretty difficult work, but it's a part of my mission. I'm a disabled person myself, and I'm hope just beginning this journey. I hope to change this agenda with you, my friends. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.